All right. Well, hello, I'm DavidDennen here with DanielTarpy again. Previously, we've talked about things like fundamental reality. We've talked about free will. Today, we're going to talk about another big and kind of related issue, emergence. We're going to talk about emergence. Personally, I found this a rather intimidating topic, somehow more intimidating than free will or even fundamental reality. Um, Maybe because there's a lot of scary concepts associated with that, like supervenience and deducibility and downward causation and stuff. I'm feeling a little more confident about it now that I've read through some of the materials on it and thought about what some of my own kind of favorite philosophers have said about it. Anyway, I think Daniel and I will have maybe some interesting differences on how we want to approach emergence and what we think emergent phenomena are. So our plan basically, I think we'll talk about some different approaches to emergence in general, and then we really want to focus on consciousness. I think we're both interested in that. So then later on, we'll, I think, get into is consciousness emergent. So I'll let Daniel get us started with some kind of general ideas about emergence. So yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
All right, cool. Thanks for the introduction. Okay, so for when we talk about emergence, what we're trying to answer some certain questions, and the question we're trying to answer is that it seems that there are some genuinely new properties in the world, and emergence wants to know or wants to answer this question about the newness. How do we account for this new thing? We also want to know what the relation is between this emergent property and the world that it emerges from. And we also want to know the historical process. Did it emerge from the world or was it always there? And what does it mean to have emerged from the world? So traditionally, we understand emergence as a second order entity, property, or phenomena not reducible to and not explainable by and not predictable or understandable in terms of fundamental properties. Normally, we could categorize emergent phenomena as weak emergence, strong emergence, and radical emergence. Weak emergence is like a flock of birds. You see as the formation of the flight cannot be deduced by each individual bird, but when they cooperate together, they make these patterns that are called emergent. Strong emergence has been used to talk about consciousness before, which is the idea that the second order phenomena is not reducible to and completely unpredictable, even in theory, from first order phenomena. But there is another term called radical emergence, which is not that there is a new property that is not reducible, but that there is a whole new space of possibility. So an example for this is computer technology. When computers were developed, no one had any concept of something called a virtual world or computer games. And yet, out of these computer machines, there emerged a second order reality, which is the virtual world that is like an extension of reality. Not just that the property or the phenomena is emergent, but the whole space is emergent. And David, I know you were going to talk about some other alternatives, maybe some new approaches to understanding or classifying emergence. Is that right?
Yeah, I can say a little bit about that. Should I go ahead, or you
Yeah,
have more
sure.
to add? All right,
Uh,
yeah. So I think that's a good beginning. Part of the difficulty of emergence I found is that there's many people have very different definitions. I think the kind of definition Daniel just give is something you would find in, well, some of the kind of modern classics on the topic, like David Chalmers' essay on strong and weak emergence, where he talks a lot about, or he makes a lot of, gives a lot of importance to what he calls non-deducibility. And I think earlier emergentists have talked a lot about non-predictability. These are kind of the same thing. I mean, it depends who you ask. There's maybe some distinction between deduction and prediction, but yeah, they're closely related, I think. So that's one way of thinking about emergence. Is something deducible, which means, given a set of statements about, um, say, an individual bird. I don't know. That's a tricky example, but let's take a life as an example. So given a set of statements about, inanimate matter, can you deduce living matter from, or technically statements? Can you deduce statements about living matter from statements about inanimate matter? And this gives you more of an epistemological view of emergence. And there can be interesting reasons maybe to have an epistemological view of emergence, but it's more about like, what do we know rather than what is actually there in the world. What is there may be known to us in certain ways or may not be known to us in certain ways. But what factor does that play in the phenomenon itself? And you can make the argument that you can't, that just knowing kind of our concepts and what can be deduced from the concepts that we have doesn't necessarily tell you about what is actually in the world. So you can also have more of a ontological view of emergence. Um, and there's different ways to look at that. I think the interesting thing here is when you start looking at ontological views of emergence is that they all kind of have a central metaphor, I would say. I don't know if you noticed that. But for example, one popular metaphor is kind of a mechanical metaphor of parts and wholes. So people talk about the properties of the whole are not there in the properties of the part, or the properties of the whole emerge from somehow combinations of parts. When parts get organized in certain ways, then you get a whole, which has its own kind of new properties. And that's really kind of a mechanical or electrical kind of metaphor in my view. So you have people like, one kind of famous example of this is William Wimsatt, who's one of a famous emergentist, or someone, a well-known philosopher who wrote about emergence, and he uses a lot of electrical examples like oscillators and amplifiers and stuff. And earlier people in this kind of mode of thinking talked about clocks. Now, you can't necessarily deduce or predict the properties of clocks from the properties of the parts of clocks, or the properties of clocks as wholes are not to be found in the properties of the parts of a clock. So is that kind of thing. There's also more processual kinds of views, or maybe more organic views of emergence based on something becoming, a kind of whole thing that becomes more complex, kind of more interrelated, more closely related to what's outside of it or whatever. Yeah, kind of complexifies itself, where you get processes kind of intersecting and interacting, and you get a different kind of view of emergence. Yeah, I mean, Peirce talked about it more, I think, in terms of habits, which is maybe similar to process. I don't know. Do you have any opinion on kind of the best metaphor to use for when we talk about emergence?
Yeah, so I think we want to know which question we're trying to answer when we talk about something being emergent. And if we're talking about newness, like it is something new, genuinely new, and how do we account for this newness? That's one idea. Another idea is when people talk about like consciousness as an emergent property, oftentimes what they mean is that it is just an emergent property. So it's not fundamental, it comes out of matter. And that's another way to look at emergence. So it depends what kind of question we're answering when we use the term emergence. And then that would also take us to other things like supervenience. Supervenience is the idea that the second order phenomena or properties supervene on first order properties. And this is a general idea of emergence. But you did mention before, I think it was in activism or something, where the metaphor of a parent or a mom and a baby, like the baby emerges from the mom, being itself a totally new entity. Where would that fit in with the different approaches that you mentioned?
Well, that would be definitely an organic metaphor based on organisms. Um, I think that's probably an interesting example of emergence. Yeah, I think the example I had actually mentioned was kind of the adult emerging from the child, in the sense
Oh,
that
okay. Yeah.
the child develops into an adult, and you can think about, that's more of this kind of processual version of emergence or organic version of emergence, where you don't really get into parts and wholes, right? You can't really talk about,
So it's more
the
like
parts.
this emergent property is just a more complex version of the original property.
Yeah, it's a kind of a developing process, engaging in other new interactions, maybe more complex interactions, wider interactions with the environment.
Is
Um,
there a way to get around supervenience, to have an emergent metaphysics or emergent idea that doesn't rely on supervenience? One example I have is about like software in a computer game or software in a computer. So it is true that the software supervenes on the hardware, but we can replace the hardware. So the hardware, the particular hardware is not necessary. So in a way, it's kind of like has been detached from the first order properties. It is now like a second order property that is not totally supervening on top of the first order.
mhm. So can we, so you're
I mean,
saying that's an example where supervenience maybe doesn't
it's an
apply?
example of maybe trying to get out of supervenience. So
Mm,
normally, like when people talk about consciousness being emergent, they're like, it's emergent because it supervenes on top of the substrate of the brain, and therefore, if you damage the brain or you crush the brain, consciousness evaporates, it's gone. But if we look at something like software, for instance, it's true, obviously, if you smash the hard drive, that the software will be damaged or lost. Um, but it is not exactly supervening on the hardware, and that we can
mm.
like transfer it to a different piece of hardware. Um, so, to me, I wonder if there's some. I mean, I'm working on some ideas about how we can have emergence and still avoid supervenience and avoid the idea that emergent property is just an emergent property.
Yeah, I mean, I would have problems with the software metaphor just because it gets into more of a kind of dualistic picture. And there are interesting dualistic versions of emergence. William Hasker is an interesting example of this, where, and it's an interesting question, I think, for someone like him, what kind of supervenience or what kind of relation there is between consciousness, which he sees as a kind of a field that the brain produces,
Hmm.
that's kind of like a magnetic field. He sees consciousness as kind of like a field that the brain produces, but it is tied to the brain. And there's a big question for him whether consciousness can survive, in separation basically from the living brain.
Yeah. I
And
mean, it
which
is
I'm
similar
not,
to the software concept because the software can survive separation from the particular hardware by being transferred to a different hardware. Um,
yeah.
yeah.
But I would not generally use that as a kind of my paradigm case of emergence. I would take something more kind of more naturalistic. Um,
Well, speaking of the like natural metaphors, so again, I come back to this like, okay, mother and child. So the idea of radical emergence is the idea that something new. I mean, the examples were given for evolution or biological evolution, how something develops that not only creates a new property and a new phenomena, but creates a whole new space, a whole new track for evolution to flourish. And something like a mother and a child, a mother, gives birth to a child. The child becomes totally separate. It is not supervening on the mother. It is not dependent on the mother for its reality. And is there any ideas of emergence that can fit in with that concept? Is there any way to explain emergence as this kind of complete separation?
Let's see. So complete separate. Well, yeah, I don't know about, I wouldn't say complete separation. I mean, one of the kind of classic hallmarks of, what is it? Let me see if I can just quickly find that. The classic hallmarks of emergence. So for example, Mark Bedow, I don't know how to say his name, Bedow, um, kind of writes the classic hallmarks of emergence. They're somehow constituted by and generated from underlying processes. And you could see like a child is generated by processes,
Yeah,
living processes in the mother. Emergent phenomena are, part two, emergent phenomena are somehow autonomous from underlying processes. And so that kind of gives us, fits in with this parent-child example or mother-child example. But is there, I think it's more like a relative autonomy, which you
mm,
get, for example, in the emergence of life. Things don't become totally autonomous from their
yeah,
environments, but they gain kind of degrees of freedom. We might talk about, as we talked about with like the free will
yeah,
issue, you get certain degrees of freedom from environmental contingencies, but you're always, of course, still reliant on environments. So I think it's more about, I mean, I think we're talking about emergence and at least the emergence of life and mind. We're talking about gaining degrees of relative autonomy from the environment. I don't think that necessarily works with all kinds of emergence, depending on how widely you want to see, how widely you want to cast that net. I mean, some people, these processual emergentists, basically see emergence everywhere. Anytime you have processes that are interacting, you get emergent properties. Um, so like everything can be emergence, like something, when the mass of a particle could potentially be an emergent property because mass or velocity or any of these like basic things are only measurable from particular perspectives. So there's not
yeah,
like one mass that a thing definitely has. It depends on its motion and all of that. So it depends on where you're measuring it from. So that would be an emergent property, and that's something that's very basic and not, you wouldn't really say that that's autonomous. Um, but then there are people who would not want to consider that a case of emergence as well. So
yeah.
I don't
Interesting.
know. How widely do you see emergence happening? Like I tend to
Well, I guess
see, yeah, go ahead.
the problem, I guess, is to define what we when we use the word emergence, what we're talking about. If we're talking about new properties, I guess the other problem is what we mean by new.
Hmm.
If we can have some kind of like I know we discussed about it before through email about some kind of way to determine if something is a new property, if something is an emergent property, it'd be something new, and how do we determine that? Um, and then the second thing, when if we define what a new property is, then the emergent theory would have to account for what is the relationship between that new property and the world it emerges from. The second question, of course, we would want to answer is, did it really emerge? Is it really new, or was it just always there in the world and just now we can see it? Like, the color blue was always there, and the ancients couldn't see it until something happened, so they're able to see it. I'm not sure if that's accurately the case, but I've read that.
Hmm.
which
Right.
which brings me to this another idea for emergence. I just call it conduit emergence, but the idea that it could be that the structures, like the brain structure itself, evolves. And so from our perspective, it looks like consciousness is a new property in the world, but that's only because the brain has evolved in such a way that it can incorporate consciousness into it. So this idea comes from, I mean, obviously this idea has been around for thousands of years, but the idea that consciousness is fundamental and is not something produced by the world. This idea was also given by Hameroff and Penrose, with this idea of the microtubules in the brain creating a quantum computer for consciousness, and that consciousness is somewhere outside existence and comes into existence through these quantum machines that we call brains. And the idea is that um, it could be that the brain or the mind, no, no, the brain's evolving and it becomes a particular structure that can receive the signal of consciousness. So that way you merge idealism and emergence together in this particular view.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. So a bunch of things there. There's a question. So one question is like what emerges, and we've mentioned properties a lot. Um, I mean, you could also think of substances emerging, the properties,
Entities.
substances, yeah,
Yeah.
entities, organizations, structures. You can think of capabilities or functions or powers of things emerging. So that's one thing, and it's there will probably be, I mean, there is some disagreement, like in the literature, about how to talk about consciousness. I think Chalmers um, calls that a property when he's writing about it in the context of emergence, a consciousness as an emergent property. Someone like William Haskers, Haskers, I forget, treats it as a substance, like a field, I guess, but that he treats that as basically a substance, emergence of a new substance. Someone like an activist, and I would say also pragmatists would see it more as the emergence of a function or as a maybe a property of behavior or something like that. So that's one question, is kind of like what emerges, what is the thing that we're talking about emerging, and maybe all of those things can be what emerges. And
Like I think in general, if we describe something, it seems pretty easy to classify it as something emergent or not. So, for instance, consciousness or a computer game. Now, it gets a little bit tricky when we start getting down into the weeds about what exactly, where do we exactly draw the line between something emerging versus, just it's just a property of the organization. So we get like the birds flying. Is there flight patterns? Is that totally emergence? I guess that's why we call it weak emergence. But it's really hard to find the exact line. But at the same time, we can talk about larger scale things, and we can just intuitively know that we would call something like that new or emergent. Um, Whether or not we can decide, we can like classify it as a property or behavior, I guess that goes down to like what is, we have to define what consciousness is first in order to say if it's a property or behavior. But we can at least say, or we can at least have some agreements that I think everybody across all the different aisles will agree that it is some kind of new property. And even if you're an idealist and you believe that consciousness is part of matter, it's always been there and it's fundamental, it at least seems to emerge at a higher order or a more complex uh, relationship to the world. So, like how an animal has less whatever this consciousness is, but then a human has more. There seems to be that emergent process where it comes into the world more and more. So even if you do believe it is fundamental, you would still agree with some kind of emergent or evolutionary emergence and how it is presented to the world or how it displays to the world.
yeah, at least generally. I mean, I'm trying to a little bit avoid getting too much into consciousness yet, because I think there's some other points to make about emergence. But yeah, I think most philosophers, well, yeah, it's a tricky question. Because there are philosophers, I think, like Bradley, who sees change as part of appearance, not part of reality. So the change that we see is um, an illusion in a kind of sense. And there's, in another very different way, there's illusionists, and I'm a little bit hard to figure out what their stance on emergence would be. I mean, some of these emergent things that people think are emergent, like consciousness or free will, they would say are illusions in some sense. And there's kind of these block universe people where everything's kind of like fundamental
Yeah.
reality is kind of set. And then that's another kind of like Bradleyan thing where change actually real, or is it just an illusion, or what? yeah, so that's a really but interesting issue. I do want to come back maybe later to kind of different views of how consciousness emerges. One point I want to make is the criteria, or bring us back maybe to the criteria for emergence for a second. Um, and these are like very, there's very many different views, of course, on what criteria we should apply for emergence. Um, I don't really want to go through go through all of them. But one that yeah, you could see this as epistemological and ontological as well, just to get like a general kind of picture. So we talked about unpredictability and non-deducibility. These are sometimes given as, let's say, epistemological criteria for emergence. Then there's things that are more maybe ontological, like involving complex systems or systemic functions that you don't have in the parts of a system, you don't find in the parts of a system, different kinds of hierarchy, um, reciprocal connections, reciprocal causation, things like that, multiple realizability. You go back to like the supervenience kind of issue. Um, yeah, William Wimsatt kind of interestingly gave negative criteria for emergence. So we looked at what are the criteria that we can say is that we could give for things not being emergent, and then whatever is emergent is whatever does not have these
Okay.
properties. But the thing that I find most useful actually is the work of Terence Deacon, and you can see, I'll try to briefly apply it to the flock of birds example that you gave. So Terence Deacon gives these three kinds of dynamics. You have these basic thermodynamic processes, which you would find kind of throughout the universe, which is a kind of stability, right? Things kind of tend towards equilibrium, to this unchangeable condition where things kind of even out. There's nothing, nothing kind of sticks out. So like a hot cup of coffee will kind of gradually go towards room temperature, will equalize with the room temperature. So maybe the temperature in the room will raise by a tiny amount and the cup of coffee will go down to like the kind of base temperature. So the question is then, how do you get new stuff out of this, where the tendency of the universe is all kind of to make everything kind of the same, equal. And so you look at what dynamics could produce new things. And one interesting, the basic kind of like new dynamic would be where two thermodynamic processes, or we call these homeodynamic processes which all kind of tend to go in a certain direction to achieve a kind of state of equilibrium, where two of those kind of conflict with each other or kind of constrain each other, and you get patterns. Like one example is a whirlpool, where you get streams of water or a stream of water, and then something disrupts that, and you get two streams of water that are both trying to go maybe down the hill or whatever, but they conflict with each other and they create these eddies or whirlpools or whatever. And that's a new kind of a thing, maybe. So there's new patterns in nature that you get when these kind of fundamental universal processes constrain each other, conflict with each other, intersect with each other. And then you can build up, like when two of those processes end up constraining each other, he calls those, so when two homeodynamic processes are constraining each other to create kind of a new pattern, he called that morphodynamics. And when you get morphodynamic processes interacting with each other, sometimes you can get something very new, which he calls teleodynamics, which is kind of like the beginning of life, let's say, just for now. So the question of something like, a flock of birds is an interesting example, because you have living things, which is a new kind of thing, or at least was a new kind of thing at one time, birds, life, whatever. But then you have those kind of goal-directed creatures, right? They have their goal as birds. They have their bird goals, whatever, their aims. And in the process of achieving those goals, they kind of come into this new pattern. So we might call, I don't know, it gets complicated when you get higher up and these more kinds of processes interacting with each other and constraining each other. You might call like a flock of birds, flying in that a special shape, a case of morphodynamics created through teleodynamic creatures interacting with each other in a certain way. Oh, I think in emails you've mentioned the example of traffic jams too. I think that's a really interesting example where you have kind of these goal-oriented processes, right? Each person in the car has their goal. They're going somewhere. They're doing something. They want to get from point A to point B. But in the process of doing that, they're all constraining each other. And of course, the environment is another kind of constraint on their behavior where it ends up creating this new thing, which is a traffic jam. The traffic jam itself doesn't have a goal. No one wanted the traffic jam, but it's just like the intersection of all these goal-directed processes ended up creating this new, in this case, unwanted thing. And I just find that way of thinking about it to be especially useful, but there may be problems with it.
Yeah, I mean, that way of thinking about it does account for weak emergence. And as a side note, but I read somewhere about the idea of life being an escape of entropy, and this escape of entropy being like a new thing in the system. But okay, but if we have traffic jams and birds, this is, I guess that's why it's called weak emergence, because it's still not a new, it's not a new thing.
Yeah, well, it'd be morphodynamics, but not teleodynamics. Teleodynamics is where you get a living thing, and you get that out of, at least in Deacon's theory, you get that out of these interaction of morphodynamic processes. But once you have teleodynamics, then they can interact and create either new morphodynamic patterns or new, like
Yeah,
strong emergence of teleodynamic.
The problem with using like these, like I'm sure he must have some examples, but that's why we have like it's sometimes hard to think of these things in abstract without having some kind of metaphor, some kind of practical example to give.
Mm-hmm.
So like, okay, maybe it's true that two morphodynamic things can create a teleodynamic or well, you know, some kind of process, but we could just say that, but do we have any evidence for that kind of thing?
Well,
Where
it's partly conceptual, but there's pretty concrete examples of it. So, and it's a question about whether these actually exist in nature. But Deacon and his various collaborators have described a what they call an autogen or autogenic virus, which is basically where you get two morphodynamic processes, self-assembly and reciprocal catalysis. This gets really complicated into chemistry. We probably don't want to go into all the chemical details, but you get these kind of common chemical processes, self-assembly and reciprocal catalysis. And when these kind of interact, you get these, or one thing you could get are these kind of cellular shaped things, which are capable of kind of repairing themselves, creating new versions of themselves, and so on. So it gets very, very detailed, but
I suppose
yeah,
it is similar to the game of life. So the game of life has very few laws that govern the structure or the process, and yet out of that great complexity can emerge. But still, this is talking about weak emergence, because so even if we can't predict what will happen in, like I know you mentioned this about we can simulate it. So we can simulate the game of life, even though we cannot predict it. So if we can't predict a traffic jam or the flight pattern of birds, I mean, sometimes we actually can predict it based on what we know. Like we can predict what will happen in a game of life based on the initial starting point. But even if we couldn't predict it, it's unpredictable. So you know, it would account for a weak emergence. We can at least simulate it. So we know that we have cars on streets, and we might not be able to predict where the traffic jam will or how exactly the traffic jam will happen. But we can, you know, it's not, we don't need to add anything new to our understanding in order to come up with traffic jams. But if we have no life or no consciousness, and then we do have consciousness, it seems that we need to have some new knowledge, new information, new understandability, but something new has to come in our mind as it comes into the world in order to explain this phenomena. So I think that's, for me, that's what really emergence is trying to account for. And okay, it's possible that maybe they can start off on these, and build up a theory to explain how it's possible that something new can develop out of something that we wouldn't consider new. But it still seems that I don't know if anybody has sufficiently shown that you can come up with something, you can account for something new based on the information, the understanding that you have in the first order properties. Like, I imagine well, I guess there was no consciousness, you wouldn't be able to even think about it. But if you like dropped into a world and life did not exist there, it seems like you would have to have more information than just the information contained in the inorganic matter in order to come up with the concept of life.
Yeah. Yeah, but I would want to separate, like, I don't think the epistemological view of emergence is that useful. Again, I don't think like what we know or don't know, I mean, that's important for us, but I don't think it's I don't think it's a useful way to think about what is new or how new things can come into the world. So I would want to, in talking about emergence, I would not really want to rely on concepts like predictability or even simulation or deducibility or anything like that. And I would even also want to avoid weak and strong emergence, um, kind of on the, well, those have slightly confusing meanings. I think they, at least in kind of the Chalmers definition, it kind of mixes up epistemological and ontological parts of the question. And I think I would want to avoid kind of weak and strong, the vocabulary of weak and strong emergence. I mean, what we know and don't know is interesting. What we can predict or not predict is interesting, but I'd kind of like put that on one side of as not really what I'm that
I guess then
interested in.
maybe the question is what is something new? I mean, I guess we can tell something is new when we see it, but how would we describe a new thing?
Yeah, well, I think that
If you don't use those terms, how else we describe something new?
well, I think let's see. Yeah, so how do you describe something new? I think that of course you never can, in a sense, you can never predict like what is new. That's why by definition it's new. I mean, there is a big question whether something is locally new or universally new. And again, this gets back to like what we know and what we don't know. Like I wouldn't want to, like I'm not sure. Yeah, the question of newness is also, I think that might be getting on the wrong track because do we know anything, there may be, this Earth, maybe a nearly exact copy of this Earth exists somewhere else in the universe and everything, but we're a little bit behind or whatever. So everything here has already happened there. And, so nothing here is really new. Nothing that we know is really new. So I wouldn't necessarily want to apply newness. I mean, again, that's more like epistemological. Is this new, but new compared to like what we already know, or new compared to what we don't yet know, or anything like that. So again, I would want to see it more in terms of interacting processes, not like what is absolutely new, but what happens when processes interact and the processes transform into something that's new for them, right? So every time a child turns into an adult, that's a new thing for that person. And in a way, I guess it's a new thing in the universe. But the important thing is that there's this transformation going on. And how do we explain that? How do we account for that? What can we know about it? I mean, those are interesting questions, but there's also kind of the brute fact of things transforming, constantly transforming through interaction, which I think for me is the important thing, not whether something is.
I guess we can avoid talking about newness, but I don't think you can avoid talking about the thing that we are referring to when we say something is new. So if we say, like, even if we say that consciousness, we'll avoid the term newness for consciousness. Well, we still have to talk about consciousness. We still have to explain what it is. And if we can't explain it through a back order process development, like you can reverse engineer a machine, you can take it apart and find out the pieces. If you can't reverse engineer consciousness, then that would have a problem for the theories that you mentioned that try to get to final stage process through the initial process. So like we can see an adult and reverse engineer them back to being a child, but can we reverse engineer something like consciousness? And if you can't, would that mean that this consciousness is fundamental then? Or is there some other way of explaining it?
Yeah. I'll write that down. I'm wondering if maybe we should take a bit of a break before we get into the
All right,
consciousness stuff. It sounds like
sounds
maybe a
good.
good time to get into the consciousness. So maybe I'll take like a 5-minute break and then
All right.
we can continue.